Welcome to the Future of Antitrust. This is the first webinar by the Antitrust Education Project. I am Robert Bork, Jr., president of the project, and AEP is a response by legal scholars, thinkers, and practitioners to the recent and ongoing progressive insurrection in American antitrust theory and application. The AEP was created to help teach a new generation of Americans about the successful centerpiece of antitrust policy for the last 40 years, the consumer welfare standard. We are honored today to have Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, as our featured guest. The senator has been at the center of legal policy in this country for 4 decades, working to preserve the Constitution and the rule of law. He has done more to establish a conservative judiciary than almost any other senator. And on a personal note, I would be remiss not to thank Senator Grassley personally for his steadfast support of my father's nomination to the Supreme Court 34 years ago. And if I might also add, allowing my son to intern for him in 2018. Since the senator's time is precious, let's jump right in. Senator, the consumer welfare standard is the idea that a given merger, acquisition, or business practice should be judged in antitrust enforcement strictly on how it affects consumers. Throughout your career in Washington, that has been the standard in place, a durable one that has stood the test of time and seen the tripling of the size of the American economy. What are your observations about the consumer welfare standard and how it has worked?
I think it's been largely successful, particularly in grounding antitrust laws, providing better certainty, and certainty in law is very important, as well as in outcomes. I'm concerned that there's been some lax enforcement, particularly at high levels of concentration in certain industries. Senator Klobuchar and a bill that she and I have put in provided additional resources, I should say money probably rather than resources. So our bill as well with Senator Lee does the same thing. If our current laws are unable to adequately address concerns in agriculture and big tech, I'm certainly open to considering targeted legislation. And I've always had a concern that people, particularly in the Justice Department, I guess it would apply to the FTC as well, probably don't really have an understanding of agriculture and the importance of it in our society. So I've kind of been very cynical about antitrust working in that area.
So are you, you said you've put in a bill, you're working, we've heard that you're working with Senator Klobuchar to basically adopt the Sickling proposals, and that your American Innovation and Choice Online Act would allow the Con-controlled FTC and the Cantor-controlled DOJ to decide what is and what is not illegal behavior. Is that?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as what Senator Klobuchar has gone on some of her legislation, but I'm working with her on trying to get some understanding of what we could do in a lesser area. One of the House bills trying to reach some sort of a compromise with her on that. But I'm continuing to have these conversations with Senator Klobuchar. We haven't reached any agreement at this time, but it would deal with the amount of authorities that the agencies would have. I think we should have a standard that provides uniformity and predictability, and I support strong enforcement, but I don't support agency overreach. There are concerns about overregulation, but we must make sure that these markets are working properly.
Now, your team bill with Senator Lee, who, as you probably know, wrote the introduction to the new edition of the Antitrust Paradox. How is that different? Are you getting a good hearing from Senator Klobuchar about the things that you have in there that would be different than what she wants to do?
I guess I'd have to rely upon what Senator Lee says about his negotiations with her. But the TEAM Act strengthens current antitrust law. I think I'd sum it up by saying it provides additional authority and increased resources. Of course, Klobuchar and I have already passed a bill in the Senate that gives additional resources to the FTC. The TEAM Act, I think, builds upon our current antitrust laws to improve how they work. Other proposals want to move very drastically away from what has been the standard for the past 40 years, which I think risks massive unintended consequences. One important thing is to keep the consumer welfare standard, which ensures both that the unelected judges aren't using antitrust law to push their own politics, and that the antitrust laws are applied to benefit people, not just picking winners and losers. Our bill would tighten merger review requirements and standards, and most importantly, make it harder for defendants to rely on speculative economics to justify anti-competitive conduct. It also repeals Illinois brick and Hanover shoe to allow indirect purchasers to recover damages for anti-violations. And I'm particularly interested in getting this Illinois brick issue taken care of, because way back in the 1980s, because of people in agriculture wanting to sue, they saw Illinois brick as an impediment for their suing. And I thought I could get it repealed and help them. I didn't get any legs at all. So under Senator Lee's leadership, maybe we'll get a chance to get something out here so that we can get that problem solved that I couldn't get solved 30 years ago.
Now, one of the things I think in the TEAM Act is Senator Lee's, and I assume your view that the FTC should be removed from antitrust enforcement and it should all be vested in the Department of Justice. You go along with that view?
Yeah, but for more good government reasons than just antitrust reasons, I'm supportive of moving the antitrust enforcement within DOJ. And you're right, that's what the TEAM Act does. When you have both FTC and Justice enforcing competition laws, I think it's inefficient. I think it's duplicative and often leads to confusion. Isn't a little bit ridiculous for two government agencies with similar responsibilities to argue, sometimes taking different positions, arguing over who's going to enforce this and who's going to enforce that sort of merger or enforcement of antitrust laws?
So you'd like to see it all in the Department of Justice?
Yeah.
Coming back to what you said a few minutes ago about the consumer welfare standard, and I think I heard you basically endorse the continuation of the consumer welfare standard. Pretty much everything that's going on at the FTC today and the people who are the brain trust behind all this antitrust weaponization, like Tim Wu at the White House and Mr. Cantor, who's pending for justice at the I think they're pretty much opposed to the consumer welfare standard and are doing everything possible to slowly pick away at it. Do you have any concerns about that?
Yeah, I have concerns because it seems like they're overstepping their bounds. I think they're very open about wanting to do that, have the FTC be much more aggressive. And I think if it's going to be done, it ought to be done by legislation, not by majority of three on the FTC deciding to do it. And I think they want to pick winners and losers. And I think we ought to let the free marketplace decide that, as long as the government is seen as a referee and an honest referee in various interests within the economy.
So I imagine that you, along with many of your colleagues, were very irritated by the bait and switch when the Biden administration knowingly misled the Senate into confirming Chairman Khan as chairman or chairperson.
Now, this might irritate some of your listeners, and it maybe look like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, because I did vote for her. So I'm sure that some of your people that would be listening wouldn't appreciate my voting for her and then talk about got to change the antitrust laws, or I don't agree with the direction it's going. But I've also been irritated sometimes. Now, this is over a period of 40 years. Sometimes the FTC not doing their job, and I thought somebody a little stronger in that position would help. And she's obviously about as strong as you get, but that doesn't mean I agree with the votes that they just recently had to completely disregard the direction that the Trump administration has taken for FTC, and really not even outlining where they're ready to go. Just that we're going to be much more aggressive. They haven't outlined what they're doing, and they just say they're going to be more tough. Well, that brings the uncertainty that when we first opened this program, you heard me say we need antitrust enforcement that's predictable and certainty. That's very essential for our free market system to operate, and those people that invest capital to have certainty.
I hear you, and I agree. I'm just concerned, and one can be forgiven for. It's not my place, but one can be forgiven for voting for a more aggressive regulator. But since she's taking power at the FTC, she's muzzled Republican commissioners, gagged the staff, stripped out longstanding bipartisan agreements on process and doctrine. Are you concerned that this is getting out of control over there? The state is usurping the state is usurping the legitimate role of the Senate, the administrative state, that is.
Well, if you're talking about stripping the legitimate roles of our legislative responsibilities, then I want to say I'm going to have to wait and see and study what the law says vis-a-vis what they're doing. If they're going outside of the power they have that Congress gave them, and don't forget, the FTC's existed for over 100 years. I'd have to review all that to say that they're out of character. But the extent to which they want to be an harassment to business through what they're doing and put a lot of doubt in the private sector's decision making, that's bad for the economy. That's about as far as I can go right now.
Okay. So, I mentioned earlier that you've played a key role in confirming more than 220 federal judges in the Trump administration alone. And I don't have any idea what the number would be over the course of your career. But what's happening now seems to be moving power into the hands of federal agencies and away from the courts, who have been essentially, the judges in the Supreme Court have, gave legs to the consumer welfare standard, and now it looks like these regulatory agencies want to, take it apart.
Hey, you're asking me a question that concerns me very definitely. But don't you think we have to blame the Supreme Court more than we do the Congress in this regard? Because when the Supreme Court in the 80s ruled in a case, I can't think of the name of it right now, but they ruled with this standard that we got to give these agencies more authority because they're in the executive branch of government, and the executive branch of government is responsible to the people of Iowa and not, I mean, the people of the United States, and not to the Supreme Court. This is what they did through the Chevron case.
Right.
They said that these agencies, because they're in the executive branch, and the executive branch, at least through the president, is responsible to the electorate, we need to give them more authority. Now, I think the Supreme Court, sorry, they made that decision, and I hope they make a decision to go back and take more power back to the courts to say whether or not these executive agencies are overriding their legal authority or not, rather than just relying on the Congress as a whole. Congress should be a check on the executive branch of government, but so is the judicial branch supposed to be a check. And through the Chevron decision, they left more carte blanche authority to the agencies.
I understand. And I do believe that there's some move away from Chevron, but let's go on to something else here. Some of your colleagues in the Senate and their friends at the FTC have said they want antitrust to enforce things like equity and fairness and address workplace issues and racial disparities. Is antitrust enforcement the right place to do all of that, or perhaps someplace else?
Absolutely not. That's the responsibility. First of all, some of these things go against personal freedom and personal decision-making, and maybe even violate the Constitution. But leaving that out of the picture, it's not something that ought to be the role of an agency that's considered a regulatory agency, whether it's the Department of Justice or whether it's the FTC. I don't see that this has anything to do with competition. Now, if that's not a long enough answer, I'll give you another answer. But I think that ought to take care of it. Courts have to be guided by what you opened with, the consumer welfare standard, and not looking at areas outside of the competition law or the competitive effects of that law.
Right. I mean, I think the consumer welfare standard is all about economics and maximizing the economic benefit to consumers.
Don't forget, this administration is trying to get every agency, big or little, involved in all the stuff like this.
72 or 72.
And it's overriding everything else, and it has no business. Now, there are certain agencies of the federal government ought to be involved, maybe in some of these things, but only the extent which is the enforcement of law, not just because their own ideologically directions. For instance, they want to get the Federal Reserve involved in this. What does monetary policy have to do, and fighting inflation have to do with these things you're talking about? In fact, the extent to which the Federal Reserve is dealing with things like this administration is trying to get them involved with would detract from their major responsibility of fighting inflation. And if inflation is run rampant, it's going to hurt all the things that deal with equity and fairness.
Yeah. You know, there's a big effort, discussion about burden shifting in antitrust, but making the companies prove in advance that nothing bad will ever happen. Instead of the agencies coming to them saying, we perceive a problem and that's why we're suing to block you. So as I was asking earlier, are you concerned about this burden shifting in antitrust enforcement?
Well, I think that comes from the legislation that Klobuchar is putting in. Is that right? The question you're asking me?
Yes.
I think that goes way too far. I don't know how to go any further than that, but we want to look at fair balancing. Maybe the way I can most often put this over a period of decades is I want the government to be a fair referee between the warring factions of our economy. the competitive factions of our economy, and nothing more, nothing less.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let me ask you this then. Do you think, if my father were here, I'm certain that he would be concerned that the standards being advanced by the so-called hipster antitrusters, I think that's a term that your former colleague Orrin Hatch invented with Josh Wright, hipster antitrusters. I think he'd be concerned that what they're talking about is so vague that they would allow the government to bring any action against an executive or any company. Does that give you the government? Does that give the government too much power, too much discretion over business? And
is this too short of an answer if I told you that's the Wild West of the bureaucracy?
Yeah, that's not too short.
Okay.
So you oppose the Wild West.
In other words, it's not appropriate.
Okay. Well, we have just it says here about 8 minutes left of your segment, and I just want to ask you if you have any concerns about these bills that require American tech companies to provide access and interoperability to their platforms, software and hardware, not just to domestic competitors, but also to foreign ones as well. And do you have, do some of the antitrust proposals run the risk of gifting data of Americans to China?
Well, I believe, and we wouldn't have the great country we have or the great economic system we have if we didn't protect intellectual property and data, and we ought to be very careful. We know how China operates, and we ought to take all the extra efforts we can to make sure that these things don't fall into the wrong hands, and that most often for the last couple decades involves China. And I think we need increased data portability, and interoperability would be a good thing for consumers and would increase competition for some of the big tech platforms. But it's important that any legislative changes consider possible negative consequences of increased such portability and interoperability.
I hear you. So I want to just read you one thing and then give you a chance to wrap up with any final thoughts you might have. But I was going through an old article, and let me just read you a couple of sentences. There has grown up in recent years the pernicious notion that antitrust is some sort of open warrant for prosecutors to roam the business world like knights errant, deciding for themselves, often in defiance of conventional anatomical indicia, which are the damsels and which are the dragons. Then it refers to a former antitrust division chief, but it says before he slays them, it's fair to ask his reasons why he wants to slay them, since he sometimes sounds as if the antitrust laws were his mandate to pursue every social policy except the prevention of lascivious carriage, which we can ignore that part. But anyway, this article was written by my father in Fortune magazine in 1969, and it sounds exactly like today, exactly where we are with the FTC and this administration, wanting to have an open warrant for prosecutors to roam the business world like knights errant. It's kind of scary, don't you think?
Yes, and it's a sad commentary that is probably more of a concern right now with this administration than it has been either any Republican or Democratic administration in the past. And I think it gets back to this business. You were asking me this question: should the antitrust laws be used to enforce equity and all those sort of things that are pretty nebulous, except in the individuals' minds that are proposing them. And for them, it's a drive that they want to get accomplished that, quite frankly, ignores a society and a government based on the rule of law. And as long as we keep to the rule of law, your Dad's writing shouldn't have any concern, or what it comes out today to be, because these sort of lawyers or they're enforcers in the government that think that they can do almost anything under antitrust laws. It was never meant to be that way. And we got to ignore them and can't let them to be successful. And it's more of a scare now over the next 3 years, assuming this administration's not being reelected. It's a very scare that we're going to have to work overtime to keep from happening.
Well, that sounds like a summation. If you have anything else you want to add at this point, or?
Well, I appreciate very much your leadership. And more importantly, I appreciate the leadership your dad shown, and it's just a crime he wasn't on the Supreme Court. And I'm still happy to say to this day that I voted for his being on the Supreme Court.
It's very kind of you. I appreciate that. My family appreciates that. Thank you very much. Senator, I know we're probably a little early to say goodbye, but we can do that if you ready to go. And I just want to thank you.
If you got one more question, throw it at me. I hope I can answer it forcefully.
Okay. Are you going to co-sponsor the bill with Senator Klobuchar?
Well, we're still in negotiation, but when we get done negotiating, it's got to be a lot different than the same bill that come out of the House Judiciary Committee.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Let's leave it there. And I just want to thank you very much for doing this. I know your time is very precious, and I'm just so very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
I'm glad to be with you, and you can call on me anytime.
I'll call you tomorrow. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was great. And now let me join in Ashley Baker and Jan Rybnicek. Ashley is the Director of Public Policy at the Committee for Justice and the founder of the Alliance for Antitrust. And Jan is Antitrust and Competition Counsel at Freshfields. And I guess I would ask you, you guys need to unmute yourselves, by the way. Jan, did I say something wrong about what you do?
No, that's perfect.
Oh, okay. Well, what do you make of what the senator said? Ashley?
Sure. I don't really know where to begin. Packed a lot there into 30 minutes, which I agree with most of which, almost everything. I think he made a lot of really good points about the role of Congress, particularly. And that was very good to hear, the role of Congress and the role of courts, and how antitrust law can only serve one specific purpose. And I think going back to fundamentals, that's a very big principle that's lost. But those who want to use antitrust law to accomplish all these goals are really trying to do through antitrust what they can accomplish legislatively. And I think he made a really great point there. And I really love that he got at Chevron, and I really wish we had enough time to discuss that. But that's also a big source of a lot of the problems and the doctrine it created. And we have Brand X, in which an agency can even reinterpret its own rules differently than it did in the past, and differently than the courts did. So we have that body of law too. So we have a lot of problems here that aren't necessarily antitrust problems. And I think he had a lot of really good points about just the role of government, and I'm sure we'll get more into the specifics there, but I'll stop there and let Jan give his impression.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a fascinating interview. Great comments from the senator. He's obviously been studying this issue closely and engaging closely with his colleagues on the Hill. And I was very excited to hear his focus on the judiciary in particular, because I think the judiciary is the great differentiator between what we have and what Europe has, and how the antitrust laws are enforced in the US. It is what cabins the agency's discretion, in particular under the consumer welfare standard, which Judge Bork brought to us, and which the Supreme Court adopted. And so I think that kind of judicial review is maybe the most important aspect of the U.S. antitrust system, which is very different than what is in Europe, where you have a regulatory agency that gets to decide how the antitrust laws, competition laws there are enforced with very little judicial review. There is judicial review, but it comes many years later and after the practices have necessarily had to terminate, in particular merger transactions. And I think the benefits of the U.S. approach to antitrust we see every day, and how robust our economy is, and how much economic growth and innovation and prosperity we have here in the U.S. Now, that is not all due to regulatory policy or antitrust policy. That's a complicated thing to build a ecosystem that promotes entrepreneurship and innovation, but it is certainly a contributing factor. And I'm happy to hear that Senator Grassley has got that in mind. And there are certainly areas of antitrust that can be improved. I think the Teams Act has some aspects to it that are certainly laudable, but we have to be careful not to do too much, not to do damage to a system that has brought so much prosperity. And I think there's a heavy burden on critics in trying to create those types of changes.
I think Senator Grassley also hit the nail on the head in one of the first sentences he said. He said certainty in law is very important. And that's the underpinning of the rule of law. That's the underpinning of the consumer welfare standard. That's why this is important, to tether antitrust law to something singular such as the consumer welfare standard.
Yeah, well, on both those points, certainty and the importance of the judiciary, sometimes I wonder why some of our friends on the Republican side or on the conservative side of things are toying with supporting some of these progressive Democrat proposals, because they are explicitly about undermining certainty, undermining the existing system that has been working. And also, frankly, aren't you undermining the courts? The courts are what gave the consumer welfare standard its standing, its legs. And you start writing statutes, then you start destroying the viability of the courts to interpret the consumer welfare standard.
Absolutely. It undermines the judiciary that, those who want to do away with or chip away at the consumer welfare standard, they want to do so to replace it with malleability for the sake of being malleable. And that's something that's very much, very much at odds with conservative jurisprudence and very much at odds at the proper role of the judiciary. And if you read, for example, Senator Klobuchar's book on antitrust, which about 15% of which is about Citizens United, but the other 15-20% is about the decisions made by conservative justices and judges on conservative courts over in recent decades. Which, I mean, the first question, of course, is what conservative courts until more recently. But it's very clear that there is this sense of the courts have decided wrongly. They'll continue to decide the wrong way, particularly now that the federal judiciary has been transformed over the past 4 years. And they're taking matters into their own hands to make things, like I said, more malleable.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on a point that Ashley mentioned, which is, this is not, the state of antitrust law today has been a bipartisan effort, right? Through the works of Judge Bork and others who, through writing and speaking and advocating, really changed people's minds about how antitrust is best enforced. We got to a point where you have unanimous decisions on the Supreme Court upholding those views because, frankly, they make sense and they remedy the problems that Judge Bork and others have identified in the antitrust laws as they were enforced in the pre-60s era. So you have decisions in which justices across the political spectrum are agreeing on the correct approach to antitrust.
And one thing that I would say to those on the right who want to weaponize antitrust law, unlike Senator Grassley, is when it comes to changing the law so that it can be weaponized, you won't win that fight as a conservative. I mean, the other side has decades of experience in weaponizing litigation, and that goes with their system of jurisprudence and not ours, and for very good reason. And there's there are reasons why we built that law. That is the consumer welfare standard, and antitrust is one of the few areas of law that we've actually managed to kind of rein in a way, and has not been rapidly expanded, such as other areas of civil law over the years.
But I mean, I would just jump on that point and also mention that the current standard is still certainly strong and enforceable, right? So you have to remember that the federal antitrust agencies win, and I've done some research on the data, over the last 20 years, they win around 85% of the merger challenges they bring. So the whole setup to this problem that the antitrust laws aren't working are impossible to enforce, and that there's just anti-competitive conduct running rampant is kind of a false premise to begin with. The FTC and DOJ are successful in blocking around 85% of the deals that they challenge in the merger front. Now, the merger area, there are some very strong presumptions in the agency's favor, but that's the reality. So if the proposition is that the antitrust agencies simply aren't winning enough and we need to change the antitrust laws to fix that, that's simply not true. So you have to wonder, well, what's the other power grab that folks are going after? And I think, creating more discretion for the agencies to expand their reach is always something that the agencies are interested in.
And Jan, your math doesn't even include the deals that never get reported because they're afraid to even try them, correct?
That's true. That's true. That's a good point.
There seems to be a bunch of that going on these days. So, Ashley, you said you wanted to get more into Chevron, or is this the time and place to do it, or do you want to talk more about that?
Oh, no, that would be, we don't have enough time for an administrative law panel as well.
Yeah, okay.
That would take days.
So I came away feeling that the senator is not going to make a horrible bargain with the left, but he seems to be bargaining. And I don't know if there's room for a bargain. Do you have any sense?
Speculate.
Huh?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just don't know if there's a room for, I mean, is there anything that they want to do that would be worth doing? It wouldn't be dangerous to the order that we have now.
I mean, I don't want to speculate. I don't know what they're thinking. I'm not privy to those conversations, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that two senators are talking to each other about legislation. Whether or not that actually leads to anything tangible or there's agreement is another matter. But time will tell.
I understand. I just keep thinking what they want is to end the 40-year consumer welfare standard and have, as he said, the Wild West. Not quite sure what there's to talk about if that's your analysis of what they're up to.
Well, if he hasn't already, I think it would be great for anyone who's considering, particularly Senator Klobuchar's bills, to read her book for more insight, which is particularly critical, puts a lot of blame on the judiciary and the consumer welfare standard. So that'd be my only piece of advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's always dangerous and difficult to read the tea leaves on what's going on Capitol Hill. But I will say that there does seem to be consensus on at least one point, which is funding for the agencies, and that the agencies shouldn't be losing cases because they don't have enough money. Now, if you give an agency more money, they're going to do more investigating and do more potentially enforcing of the antitrust laws. And so I imagine that there are some those who oppose intervention by the agencies who would oppose that. But I think that is an area where there is some common ground. So we could see some additional funding going to the agencies, and agencies can take a crack at recrafting the laws in the way that they were recrafted through the 80s and the 90s.
More funding seems, I guess, on the face of it, a reasonable thing. This depends on what you're funding. So there's an office, I think they're talking about in the Klobuchar bill at the FTC, that would allow them to do lots of studies. And their studies would use whatever, strange metrics and math that they want to use to come up with all sorts of woke reasons why we should bring an antitrust case for equity or a labor issue or whatever. And frankly, if they have a lot more money to bring cases, they're just going to bring more bad cases, right? They'll be able to afford to do it. And you're, as a practitioner, Jan, you must, of course, you're probably, licking your lips, but as a policy wonk, does it concern you?
Listen, I mean, I think I'll just take the merger area as an example, because I think the Supreme Court hasn't taken a merger case in, I don't know, 50 years or something like that, I think since the 70s. And so the DOJ and the FTC have been doing have provided most of the guidance, and obviously some lower courts, providing the most of the guidance on how merger law or antitrust law is applied to mergers. And they have been, within the bounds of reason. There's, you swing a little bit on the margin here and there, depending on who's in power. But they've generally been fairly reasonable in kind of how they approach it. Now you might disagree on one or on cases here and there. What you're seeing today is a bit more or less risk aversion, right? There's always been some risk aversion in bringing cases and potentially changing the law to your detriment. And I think what you're seeing from the leadership now is less risk aversion. And I think they see it as a win-win. We'll bring the cases, and if we win them, great. If we lose them, then we've got something to go to Congress about and say, hey, look, I told you we needed to change the laws. I'm losing all these cases that I should be winning. So I think there's certainly a narrative there that might be being exploited.
So let's see. They'll be bringing so that if this bill passes, or at least the budget portion of it passes, and they start bringing cases, those cases will be going on well past this administration, I assume, and ultimately, who knows what would happen to those. So I'm sort of wondering what we should be talking about now. We seem to all fairly much appreciate what Senator Grassley said and the positions he staked out. Is there anything that he did say that concerned you? Nobody has any concerns.
I would be careful with the data portability and interoperability issue. I'm not necessarily opposed to either of those tools. They're two very different tools for two different purposes, and any legislation that would involve interoperability, I can't see it as necessarily reaching that intended goal the way that it should. And without sacrificing a lot and not really actually helping any sort of the problems. But those are two tools that are really easily conflated that don't necessarily actually help competition anyway.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think one thing if I was to nitpick on something, and I think the senator had a lot of great ideas and comments, I would say this whole modern antitrust debate, now that antitrust is in the spotlight again, like it's never been in the last however many decades, was all started by this idea, was all started from this notion that there's this growing concentration in the American economy, and that is in part or large part due to the absence of the antitrust laws or absence of antitrust enforcement. And I, as well as lots of other people, including Ashley, have been working hard to dispel people of that notion that concentration is somehow prevalent and running rampant in our economy. There were some initial studies kind of in the 2015, 2016 time period that showed a lot of concentration. And I think they've been, for the large part, debunked. And in fact, what we see is a lot of increased competition at the local level and at the product level. And so that's a narrative that's difficult to unwind, and we've been working on that. And it sounded like Senator Grassley had some concerns about concentration, and there may be some of that in some industries. Who knows? But I wanted to kind of make the point that the concentration issue is not what it maybe seemed as it was 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too sorry, go ahead.
No, you please.
I was just saying, I don't want to be too dismissive of his concerns over concentration, given that they are specific to the agriculture industry, which he knows a lot more about than I do. And I think there are a lot of issues in that industry, whether it's an antitrust issue or if it was an issue created by other regulations or selective enforcement. For example, during the FDR administration, they kind of caved to wherever the electoral power was, so into cartels in agriculture and employment and unions, and enforcement was very selective in that. And then there's a whole other regulatory regime that can cause these concentration issues. So I don't want to dismiss his concerns, because a lot of the Section 1 cases, the Sherman Act, are in the agriculture or meatpacking industries. A lot of those are prosecuted and successfully so, and those price fixing cases should be. But maybe he has identified a very real problem. Just changing all of our antitrust laws doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, I should just say that the Antitrust Education Project is spending a little time now looking into this agriculture issue of concentration in agriculture. And, there are examples of in the meatpacking business and other things that there are very few companies that control like 80% or something of the market. But again, there's always a level you have to go deeper to understand what's really going on.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I think our understanding of economics has changed a lot in the last 50 years. And, there was a time, and the early DOJ FTC guidelines reflected this, that concentration was the end all be all to merger analysis and to competition analysis. And what we've learned is, in fact, and maybe I overemphasize this in the wrong way, but concentration is not the most important determiner of whether or not competition is working or not, right? So you can have highly concentrated markets in which competition is working, and market shares don't tell the entire story. And I think a more nuanced, fact-specific approach, which is what we've kind of developed over the last 40 years or so, it benefits consumers, and in my view is the right model for enforcing antitrust laws.
I think since about the 70s, it's been pretty thoroughly debunked, the economics of what that's, there's, that strong of a link between market concentration and market power. And that's the market power is, the important factor there. And that link is really not quite very evident.
Go ahead, Jan.
I was gonna say, you asked him a good question about which agency he wants to see exist when this is all over with. I think more or less said his Teams Act with Senator Lee puts the DOJ in the driver's seat, which is a sensible proposal. I'm certainly not going to pick between the agencies. I don't have the authority, and I don't know that I necessarily have an opinion. But I do think there's something odd about having two agencies. It is something that most of our other regimes around the world don't have. And there are opportunities for conflict, and you saw this in the Qualcomm case, where you had the DOJ filing briefs against the FTC in a litigation. You have what recently transpired, which is the FTC withdrawing the vertical merger guidelines that were issued under the Trump administration, but the DOJ retaining them. So now you have two agencies kind of, at least potentially enforcing the laws slightly differently. And you have an agency at the FTC who has at times argued that it has a different standard for challenging transactions, for blocking transactions, for obtaining a preliminary injunction. So those disparities between the agencies, I think most people can agree that it would be good to at least eliminate the disparities. Whether or not you have one agency at the end of the day is maybe a different question that needs to be answered. But eliminating the disparities would be nice, because it's tough from a practitioner standpoint to talk to a client and say, well, the outcome might be X if you end up at the DOJ, but it might be Y if you end up at the FTC. And I don't think whether or not how the antitrust laws are enforced should turn on which agency you happen to fall in front of.
I agreed. Initially, I never viewed the agency jurisdiction problem as the solution having to be necessarily one agency or the other. I still don't think that's necessarily the only way to solve it, but it's over the years begun to make more and more sense. And if it's going to fall under one agency or the other, I think it has to be the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice represents the views of the United States in court, and abroad it would make no sense for it not to be the DOJ.
Well, the Biden administration seems to think that competition is a whole of government problem, and that there should be and they have 72 suggestions. Those are not all enforcement suggestions, but they seem to see it, competition problems under every bed. So
suggestions that the agencies immediately issue press releases and say, yes, we will do that. We agree completely, faster than the White House could, even get the text of the executive order online. Yes, I mean, everything being in competition problem. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, apparently rising gas prices, competition problem, not to mention, the pipeline issue, what he did within his first week or two of office, and the rampant inflation, those might have something to do with increasing gas prices. But no, apparently it's, competition between oil companies that might be colluding.
Right.
And, railroads and every other issue is a competition issue. Net neutrality used to be a blocking and throttling issue, but it was never about that, because now apparently that issue is competition, because none of the bad things that they said would happen after after the open internet order ever really happened. So competition is really just used this sort of policy catch-all now.
right. So I don't know if we want to drag this out another 9 minutes. I think we've had a good conversation. I don't know if there are any questions or even how to get to the questions. That's my problem as a practitioner here of this fine art of webcasting. So
I'll just say that I appreciate you putting on this program, because it was great to hear Senator Grassley's views. Particularly, I was very encouraged, not surprised, but by his endorsement, re-endorsement of the consumer welfare standard, which is, as everyone knows, the lodestar of antitrust and something we want to preserve.
well, I appreciate that, and I was very happy to hear that too. Although I don't know how you can have that thought on one side and then all these other things that his colleagues want to do and be entertaining those. They seem to be there's going to be a problem at some point with trying to mesh those together.
Senator Grassley has always been extremely principled and standing up for the rule of law and for the independence of the judiciary. I think that was very much reflected today. But he's also been very thoughtful, and he considers every angle and he reads everything, and that's also very appreciated.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I don't know if there are any questions, but I don't even know if we're even taking any questions. I'm trying to see if I can see something down here. Oh, there's a chat, something in chat. Let me just look. No. Okay. Well, look, folks, this has been really great. It's our first time out. Didn't screw it up too badly. I think it went pretty well. You guys were great, and I appreciate it. So I think at this point, we will wind this down. I just want to say one thing. If you want to know more about the Antitrust Education Project, go to antitrusteducationproject.org. We're also on Twitter at Antitrust EDU. And reach out to us and give us ideas for other things that we should be talking about in the antitrust world. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Jan. And thanks to everybody who's watching.
Thank you, Bob.